I can't explain it, but there is a connection, that tactile piece that you have in your hand that connects you. And it would not have been brought together if it wasn't for the ability to research, tie up all the ends, find Jim, get the story, and bring it all together. And I think it was one of the best moments I've ever had in my entire career.
Stories That Live in Us is a podcast that inspires you to form deep connections with your family, past, present, and future. I'm Krista Cowan, known online as the Barefoot Genealogist. I've spent my whole life discovering the power of family history, and I know that sharing the stories that live in you can change everything. My guests today are Wayne Abbott and Professor David O'Keefe. Now, these two men have been engaged in telling military stories for most of their careers. Historian, documentarian, they're both engaging, but also doing a really, really important work. They have a new podcast sponsored by Ancestry called Finding Heroes, where they find lost military treasures and personnel and reunite those stories with their living family members. I'm excited for you to listen in on my conversation with Wayne and Dave. David, Wayne, thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to have this conversation with each of you. Wayne, let's start with you. I would just love to hear a little bit about your journey into this particular project.
Well, this particular project, Finding Heroes, the podcast, evolved from Finding Heroes, the online series, but that evolved from a show that Dave and I worked on called War Junk for years. It's 10 years ago now we started. And the whole idea of War Junk was to tell the story of a battle or war by what's left behind on the battlefield. And that's where we really began. And these were dynamic, colorful, present-day history shows. We named it War Junk because we wanted a younger audience, which we got. And we just took what perceived to be junk and told stories. And within it, every show, we had an artifact that we tied to a soldier, that we tied to a living family member, relative. So that evolved into Finding Heroes. And then I just started talking to Ancestry, going like, we could do this over a podcast instead of a very expensive 10 minutes. Maybe we can do a podcast that's longer and we can get more in depth. And that's where we are now. And it's been a really great experience taking Finding Heroes to the podcast.
I love that. David, if you go back even before that, how did you and Wayne connect? Can you tell us that story?
Oh boy. Yeah, that's quite the story. It's over 20 years now we've been working together. And it was one of those things where both of us were independently working for History Channel, or at least History Television up in Canada. That's where we are in the Great White North. And they decided to marry us up, thinking that maybe we'd complement each other. And boy, have we. So it's been great. It's been an incredible partnership over that time, and we've done a lot of documentary filmmaking together. And then we started moving into the podcasts, and to be honest with you, we're having a lot of fun doing this.
I love that. David, what was it from your childhood or youth that got you interested in this particular field of work?
Well, I guess for me, it's a bit of a family thing. I mean, I've had, grandfather and his brothers in the First World War, and I've had my father and my uncle in the Second, an uncle in Korea, cousins in the Gulf War. And of course, I ended up joining the Army back in the 90s. And so it's always been something, military history in particular has always been something that was extremely important within the family. And then I went off and became a historian, a military historian. And actually I teach students all about that now. And that's where you find me now, sitting in my classroom at the college where I teach.
Wayne, what about you? What was it from your youth or childhood that sparked an interest in all of this?
Actually, it wasn't in my youth. I got into sports television right away, and that's where my love was. And in the late 90s, I just started wanting to do my own work in documentaries, and I came across one specific story on a Canadian World War II ship called the HMCS Athabascan, which sank 6 weeks before D-Day off the coast of France. And I became so passionate about the story, and that was my entry into the history world. I took about 9 of the survivors of this ship, because it was Canada's worst naval loss ever, with 130 men, I think 128, 130 men who died on that ship. And it was a very dramatic story. And I took 9 of the survivors over and told the story of the ship and the fallout of what happened after. And because I spent so much time in sports, I started feeling it was the same kind of elements. It's man versus man versus his environment. And it was like the ultimate game war was. And I felt I just became very passionate. And since then, I don't think there's a year that's gone by where I haven't delved into a big history project.
Wayne, was there one particular individual from that ship whose story resonated with you?
Oh, you're going to make me cry. Herm Sulkers. Man, Herm survived the shipwreck, but he tells this story about him and his buddy Sammy Sampson in the water on this piece of wood floating after the ship sank, and they were waiting for rescue, and Sammy kept falling back into the water, and Herm kept him back, and then he would pull Sammy back up on the board, and then eventually Sammy just went off into the darkness of the water, never to be found. And no, I'm wrong in that. Sammy's body was recovered, and there's a grave for him in France. I don't want to get that wrong. But it was a very powerful moment. I think it was maybe one of the most powerful minutes of television I ever told, because when Herm told me this story, and we didn't have money for reenactments or anything, I just let him talk for an entire minute without cutting away. And that never happens with my shows. But that was probably single-handedly the most powerful moment I've ever told. And then I got a phone call about a week after it went to air, and it was Sammy Sampson's relatives from Eastern Canada that didn't know that he was even buried in France until they saw the show and saw that we put his gravesite, and they didn't know. So that was kind of maybe the most impactful moment. And that's what we're still doing with Finding Heroes, the podcast. I mean, you'll see in these episodes, each episode has a family that we share, we contact, and we share information that they never knew about their loved ones who were fighting in either World War I or World War II.
It becomes less about just stories and more about people very quickly, doesn't it?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. Sometimes I think in the storytelling, and I find this even with family history, you get so intrigued by the mystery of it, or by the salaciousness of it, or by the sensationalism of it. But when you recognize the real people and the real families behind the stories, it becomes very personal very quickly. David, what about you? Do you have a particular story from the work you've done that stands out to you among all the others?
I have a lot, but there's one in particular that Wayne and I were involved in. It was our first show. We were doing a pilot for War Junk, and we were over in Hong Kong. And of course, the battle was very quick. It was over in 3 weeks, so we weren't sure what we were going to find. And we ended up over there, and one of the local archaeologists had found what looked like half of a shoulder flash from the shoulder of a uniform of somebody who fought there. And it turned out it was rather special. It was Royal Army Medical Corps, and there was only 5 doctors on the island. So we knew it was one of them. And we ended up, through Ancestry and everything else, figuring out who this was. And then we tried to contact his family in New Zealand. And we ended up bringing his son over to Hong Kong. Now, the amazing part was, and this is the fascinating thing, is he never thought about his father, because his father, he was evacuated, I think, when he was 4 months old from Hong Kong. And his father stayed to fight on. He was a doctor in the British Army. And he never saw his father. His father just never came back. And so his mother remarried, and he was raised by his stepfather to be his own. So he never really thought about it until we called. And then he ended up going up into the attic. And he said, well, wait a second, Mom left a chest. And he started going through the chest. And he started finding the photos of his father, the letters that they exchanged between each other at the time. So it was this incredible portal that just took this guy right back to what it was like. And then when he arrived in Hong Kong, this is one of the strangest things, you can see it in the show. He shows up with a picture of his father in uniform. And he's the spitting image of his father, but he now is 70 years old and his father was about 29 at the time. And that was the one thing that really stuck with me. And then, of course, we took him through it, and it was a tough story. His father had been taken prisoner. His father had been tortured, tied to a tree and tortured by the Japanese. And then along with two other men, they escaped. And they got about 500 yards down and then split up. Barclay was the name of the doctor. He went one way and the other two went another. And so when we told Jim about this particular story, he said, "Oh my God, this is incredible." And then we handed him the shoulder flash. You can imagine how that hit him. And then we realized that after reading an atrocity report that was written after by the two men who escaped, that the shoulder flash was found about 500 yards down in the direction where Barclay went. And he would have been the only doctor who would have been in that area. So in this particular case, he had one thing to ask. He said, "Look, I got to see my dad's grave. Can you please take me to the cemetery?" So sure enough, we took him to the Saiwan Military Cemetery, and we were filming this. So I jumped out of the van, and Wayne was talking to Jim, and I said, "Wayne, just give me 2 seconds. I'm going to go find the grave. That way, when we walk in, we're not stumbling across and, whatever." So I walked in, and I realized when I got in, his body was never found. There was no known grave. So there was no grave inside. There was just a name on the wall. So I had to come back and tell both Wayne and Jim that this was the case. So now the only thing that connected him to his father was that tiny little shoulder flash in his hand. And, I had doubts about the show going in as a military historian. I didn't after that, because there was something that was so magical about that moment. I can't explain it, but there is a connection, that tactile piece that you have in your hand that connects you. And it would not have been brought together if it wasn't for the ability to research, tie up all the ends, find Jim, get the story, and bring it all together. And I think it was one of the best moments I've ever had in my entire career.
That's a powerful story. You bring up an interesting concept. You talked about, him being older and that younger picture of his father. So often we view history as this linear thing. But when you start stepping into these moments, it's not linear anymore. I don't know if you've experienced that, Dave, or like how that resonates with you.
Yeah, it is strange. There's a lot of things. I think there's a lot of serendipity that goes into this, and I can't explain why. But Wayne and I have had those moments when we're sitting in an archive somewhere and, a file just pops up into our lap. And, like for instance, with the Barclay one, it just happened to be that atrocity report was right on the top, and we weren't expecting that. So, obviously you're casting your net and the odds are you're going to stumble onto something. But when you do, you got to wonder. So there's something special going on, without a doubt.
There definitely is. Yeah. Wayne, when you think about all the work you've done, and is there any connection to your personal life? Is there anything that by doing this work you've been either able to uncover from your own personal life, or that's kind of drawn you back to stories from your own family?
I'll have to be honest and say no. I'm a storyteller through and through. That's all. I am a storyteller. My family, we didn't have anyone fight in the war like David did. His father was there. My father was about 16 when World War II ended. And if it lasted a few more years, I'm sure he would have gone over. But no, it's just, I just love telling stories. And as I said, history, I got into it later, like in my late 20s, if not 30s, I started telling history programming. And then fell in love with it. And it's just a personal thing now, and trying to help others and just telling stories. And there's nothing, I don't know, there's something about war stories too that really touch me. And it's also maybe because my family didn't, I feel like I am obliged, or I'm going to use my talents to tell these stories, because look how many millions it affected, World War I and II. and there's millions of stories to tell. And it's just nuts, even with our podcast right now in the first 3 episodes. I mean, we're telling names of soldiers that have been forgotten by their own families. And that's crazy when all of a sudden, especially with the support of Ancestry, that we can now let people all over the world know the names of Jacob Williams, Walter Stewart, McNichol, Captain William Rothland, who I just finished editing his episode today. Those are the names that we can tell now that have been forgotten. And I think that's the most special thing. And that's what drives me, or at least inspires me to tell these stories.
Beautifully said. Thank you for sharing that. Dave, what about you? Something from your personal family history that's been a story that you've been able to connect with?
Oh, well, again, there's a few, but I think it's just a question. What Wayne is tapping into, I think, is the concept of empathy. And I think the more that you do this kind of research, it makes you a better person, period, because you understand what others have gone through and you can really soak it up and you can really feel it. And that's one thing I've always noticed. I mean, I a couple of years ago, about 10 years ago, I wrote a book, my first book I wrote, and I wrote it for 242 straight days. And somebody went, oh my God, 242 straight days, that must have been. And I'm thinking, well, I'm sitting at home. I got a roof over my head. I got my family around there. I had 3 square meals a day and a whole bunch of wine to drink. I was doing it. I'm like, it's not my grandfather spending 4 years in the trenches. If you know what I mean? It's just, it centers you. It makes you truly appreciative of what you have and, appreciative of perhaps maybe what you don't have. So there's a lot of things like that. And that's the reason why I enjoy doing what I do and teaching as well.
Yeah, that concept of perspective, which sometimes we lose so easily in the world today with all the technology and the advancements that we have and the comfort in which we often live comparatively, is one of the things that I love about family stories and history and looking into those particular experiences and being really specific about the details of their experiences is the perspective that you're able to gain because of that. And I think about the benefit of that as adults, as parents, as we move in the world and we have that perspective, that we're able then to transmit that to the next generation. And Dave, you do that through teaching, and both of you do that through the storytelling. I think about the connection that we need to be making as storytellers to the people who are affecting the next generation to help them gain that perspective.
Yeah, I think we both feel we're responsible to pass on the history with each thing. I mean, that's why I mentioned earlier, people kind of questioned our title, War Junk, when we did that series. It's not junk, it should be war treasures. Well, we wanted the 15-year-old boy, to watch it. And that's what we got. And we had co-viewing. And I think we just told history in a different way, in a dynamic, colorful way, being on a battlefield and showing little, if not any, archival, trying to bring the experience, the tangible experience of digging things up. Sometimes it's stuff that could kill us.
Once or twice.
And grenades and get shells. But a lot of times it was just trying to connect to that younger generation. And I'm hoping the Finding Heroes podcast does the same thing, that people can listen to it and watch it, because I think we are pushing the limits on the podcast world, because one of the things we always did, we planned out these incredible reveals with family. Like I had it orchestrated to the day they would fly over to Europe, or as David said, we even flew somebody up from New Zealand to Hong Kong. And it wasn't just bringing them in and throwing them an artifact. We carefully planned the day so that they were emotionally at a peak when we revealed the artifact, but we also wanted them to understand the importance of that artifact when we revealed it. And so now we're doing it virtually, and that's unbelievable. If you see episode 3, the two called the Lost Canteens, we virtually reveal a story just because of technology now. We don't have to take them to Europe, and it was very powerful. and we connected Italy, Canada, Mexico, and the United States on a virtually, and told this story. So I'm really hoping it makes an impact. I really hope we can do a lot more of these, and I hope it does connect with the younger generation.
As a storyteller, I'm super curious to get your perspective on this, which is, the stories themselves have power and impact and meaning. And as storytellers, I think sometimes we want to push the boundaries, letting people live in the moment of that experience versus manufacturing experiences for them in the storytelling.
I think it's a question of research. I think the deeper you dive in, the wider you spread your net, the more data you're going to find. And then that takes away sort of the space and time that sometimes you will try to fill up by perhaps gilding the lily a little bit. And you don't need to do that if you actually have the various pillars, and those pillars come through the research. And you do your stuff and you move from one, and it's organic, and you let the evidence tell the story. And that's essentially what Wayne and I have done for 21 years. And it's amazing to be able to do that and to sit back and just let it flow. And again, it's part of that charm, because we don't know when we flip a page what's going to be on the other side. And everything could change on a dime. And we've had plenty of those experiences. And that's the beauty of this career.
I think at the end of the day, the families, the best thing is we get to tell the world about their loved ones who fought in the war. And I think that really, truly is what, is central to how strong our stories are. Is because at the end of the day, as I named a few names earlier, Dave and I could probably list 100+ names of soldiers that we've told stories for, that if we didn't do it, nobody would know their names.
There's this idea in the military of honor. And sometimes just the speaking aloud of the name is a way to honor them. But what the two of you do is so much more than that. You're restoring not just their name being spoken out loud, but their story. You're restoring their identity. You're restoring their connection to their family. When you think about that and you think about all the stories you've told over the years, is there any family that has come back? Has there ever been a rest of the story or a more information that's come out? Or do you just move on to the next story because there's so many to be told?
It's always a continual relationship. I mean, I'm still in touch with people and I'm sure Wayne is too, and I know Wayne is too, that we have discussed stuff or revealed stuff too, and then they'll start digging and they'll find out more. And that's the brilliant part. Sometimes, I mentioned, Jim Barkley before, and this is not uncommon, where sometimes in the attic, they'll find the letters and there'll be this incredible love story, or there'll be something about their family which they didn't know. And it's really amazing to see. But yes, they're always coming back and, exchanging what they found and how the story and how the interpretation of the story in their family has developed over the years.
Yeah, no, very much so. I mean, you do lose contact with some families, but other ones you stay in touch with. And but there has been a lot of stories. It's hard to keep up, but it's always nice when they share new information. Or a lot of times they'll just say, our family now. I mean, in our first episode of Finding Heroes, the podcast, it was on a lost plane that was went missing off the coast of Florida in 1945. And we uncovered information about an 18-year-old who was on that plane, Alfred Zawicki. And his niece said that, the family had kind of forgotten him, but now she's going to leave his, like an 8x10 picture of him out in the open in her apartment so that she can actually see him every day. So I think those are the kind of stories that really kind of, make you happy that there's a new connection with the family.
Yeah, because ultimately these stories, they're not just entertainment. They are real people, and those connections are real. And I think the work that the two of you are doing, putting those stories out into the world, is powerful and impactful and needful in the world today. But the impact it has on the families is immeasurable, ultimately.
Yeah, you hope so. I mean, in a way, you just hope, because I mean, I think Dave's the same way. Anybody who puts on the uniform and fights for your country and fights for freedom, is a hero.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited for the world to know more about this podcast that the two of you are undertaking now, and excited that Ancestry has a role in helping to support that in any way we can. Since this is a podcast, I suspect, podcast listeners always are looking for another podcast. So I'm going to wholeheartedly recommend the podcast that the two of you have. And as you look forward to the future of the rest of the season that you've got planned, is there a particular episode you can tease us about that you're excited about?
I think all 3 episodes are great. They're all very different, but I think with each episode, I pitched it saying there's going to be an aha moment every episode. And we've proven that in the podcast world, we can do that. We're not just talking, we're not being reactive, we're being proactive with our storytelling. So you will see, as in our 3rd episode called The Lost Canteens, you will see us do a live reveal over a podcast. Family that didn't have any information at all about their uncle. And it was a very emotional experience for, I think, all of us, because we were telling this family information about their uncle that they didn't know. And this was all done live over a podcast, live record over a podcast. So I think, watch and tune in. I think there'll be something for everyone. Be very reflective. It's fun at times, and it's very emotional. You'll see me break down a few times.
He does that.
That happens around here as well, so I understand that.
No, I think what Wayne said, I think he touched on it nicely, where each one of the episodes is different and really remarkable. I mean, the first one we touch on, believe it or not, the legend of the Bermuda Triangle. Even though we're not going into it, it's one of the big stories that helps start that legend. And then the second one, we're looking at a medieval cave during the First World War, and it has connections, all over the place. And then in the final one, we're talking about a very special unit that was created during World War II, which was a special forces unit made up of half Canadian and half Americans. And they fought in Italy. And a lot of people don't realize that. So you can see the kind of eclectic nature within the context of military history that we do.
But we should say, though, that it's great to listen to them. But let's drive some traffic to Ancestry's YouTube channel, because they're visually spectacular. I mean, we've because we have a lot of footage as well in archival, like the 3rd one, which is based in Italy. We've been on the battlefield, so you get a visual experience as well as just the audio experience. So if anybody does hear this, please try to get to Ancestry's YouTube channel and watch the Finding Heroes podcast.
Yeah. Always driving traffic to that YouTube channel. You'll find my face there too. Well, thank you both very much. Before we wrap up, I always end the podcast with the same question. And as you think about the future, as you look forward to, the impact you want your work to have made in the world, or what you hope for these rich stories that you've left behind, is there any kind of hope you have for the future?
Well, with the Finding Heroes podcast, we just want to keep doing more of them. I think with the podcast world now, and we don't need the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars to travel, we can, I think, touch more people and tell more stories.
Yeah, I think what Wayne's touching on is we get a chance to develop that kind of empathy within people. And I think that's something that the world needs a lot of at the moment. And particularly moving forward is just understanding what people had to go through and did endure on many occasions. So that's certainly something that I'd like to see as the legacy of what we do.
Yeah, well said. Thank you both very much. I appreciate you being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Pleasure.